So the recent NATO summit wrapped up, but unfortunately, Ben Wallace seems to have, well, almost caused somewhat of an international incident by, well, accusing Ukraine of treating us like an Amazon for weapons delivery. Um, it's a bit of a bizarre comment, but in some way, I sort of understand where he's coming from. Like I say, we'll read the full comment later. And I understand why, because again, there are two perspectives. You've got to look at Ukraine's perspective, but you've also got to look at the UK's perspective and how the rest of the NATO alliance can sometimes perceive Ukraine's well pleas for armaments and for weaponry. But overall, this has, to be honest, it's been a good summit. It's been a generally good one. It's been very, very well received, and I think that once again, in in very much to Putin's dismay, it has reaffirmed not only NATO, the ties to NATO from the other countries, but it has also very much strengthened the alliance. And a lot of people thought, oh, this is it. Ukraine's finally going to get an invitation to join NATO. Well, no, that was never, ever going to happen. There is no going to be uh, an invitation from Ukraine, from NATO to Ukraine, certainly while the invasion is going on. That is a fact. So until at least this war is over, there is going to be no NATO offer. But I do agree, certainly with a lot of the Ukrainians are saying, certainly with a lot of what other defense officials are saying, that to protect Ukraine's future from, well, further Russian aggression, it definitely needs to join NATO. But there are some other things that Ukraine obviously has to sort out before it can actually get into NATO. But before we do that, though, we'll get into some of the stuff that Ben Wallace has said, some of the stuff around that, and in particular, maybe how those comments were sort of perceived by certainly Zelensky. So before we do get onto that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And of course, there's the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club down below as well. So thank you very much to all the people who do help support the channel. Even if you do, just click on the like and share button. Like I say, it is very, very much appreciated. So I have always been, right from the very start, we should supply Ukraine with weapons. Whatever it needs, we should supply it. And not just us, but every country. And like I say, in terms of sort of uh, countries in sort of the list, the league table, we are certainly the second when it comes to sort of supplying Ukraine. Like I say, only America is really sort of ahead of us. Then I think it's Poland in third place, and then it's the other NATO countries. And I can't remember exactly how it works out. But ultimately, we have obviously been supplying Ukraine with a lot of armaments. We've been supplying with the NLAWs right at the start of the conflict. We have obviously supplied them with 10 Challengers that are currently out over there as well. You've also got the fact that we've just started supplying them with Storm Shadow missiles. And we've seen Ukraine use those missiles to some really good effect, especially recently in Crimea, where they struck one of the bridges, a very piece of critical infrastructure for Russia to be able to supply not only potentially Crimea, but of course the Zaporizhia front, which we can currently see that seems to be where a lot of the counteroffensives are taking place. But of course, it's not just there. There seems to be lots of movements along the front. But like I say, the Ukraine counteroffensive is taking place. But one of the big problems we are seeing is, and it has been really so since the start of the war, it is now very obvious that countries were not prepared for, well, a sustained war of this type. And even though, as a lot of people have been pointing out, there's a lot of echoing of what happened in the First World War, this is also exactly what happened in the First World War. Almost a year after the conflict had broken out, and sort of the conflict had pretty much devolved by that point into sort of trench fighting, all the allied countries had found, even Germany had found, that they and their ammo production just was not enough to keep pace with the amount of shells that they had to put out. And of course, the UK had to create a new minister for this, a minister in charge of armaments. I think it was Lloyd George that took over the position. He was Minister for Armaments. He opened up several new ammunitions factories. He kickstarted the UK chemical industry by doing some of the things to sort of produce chemical weapons, among many other things that the army sort of needed, along with medicines. So this isn't something new, but it does seem to be that once again, we are in a situation where we were just not prepared for this type of serious sustained artillery warfare. And the Ukrainian war has been very much characterized by long-ranged artillery duels and warfare. This is what has been allowing advances to happen. It has also been what has been allowing Ukraine to also defend itself. Similarly wise. So it has been sort of the key to it, and it has been the fact that you have had all the current armaments factories. I think it was, is it the Czech Republic, or is it in Norway, where you've got like it's almost NATO's main supplier of like artillery shells, and it is working round the clock to pump out artillery shells. But even then, that is still not enough. That is why what also led to Biden's decision to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions as well. So ultimately, you can see why Ukraine constantly says, look, we need weapons, we need all this stuff to help defend ourselves, because again, they are put under immense pressure. You've only just seen this weekend, potentially, I think it was one of the largest strikes across the country by Russia. So they are under pressure from their own domestic sort of arms perspective. That's why they need foreign production incorporated into their system as well. That also leads into sort of logistics stuff as well. So it's not just the fact of supplying, artillery shells. We do need to supply them with trucks and logistical capabilities as well. So there's more and more stuff going on here. But of course, let's lead to sort of this question about Ukraine joining NATO. Yes, as I said at the beginning, I think for the future, Ukraine should absolutely join NATO. That will certainly prevent any sort of further Russian incursions. But of course, there are still big questions, because one of the big reasons why Ukraine could not join NATO in the first place, not even including the stuff that was going on in the Donbass, even before that, there is still the issue of Transnistria. And this is also at the same time what stops Moldova from joining NATO as well. Even though they want to join NATO, they cannot, because that dispute there of that border region includes Moldova and Ukraine. And the rules around NATO are very clear that you cannot join NATO as long as you have a current ongoing conflict. So I've always said this right from the very beginning. That is an issue that needs to be solved at some point, and maybe you will see Ukraine and Moldova get together to say, how can we solve this Transnistria issue? How they will do that, I certainly don't know. But remember, there are an awful lot of Russian troops stationed in Transnistria as well. So I can't really see it being a military conflict, but maybe a diplomatic solution where they just go, hey, there you go, Transnistria, you exist. Excellent. Let's go join NATO. I can't say that's exactly what it's going to be, but that's a very simplistic solution to what is, to be honest, a very complex problem. And I will admit that. But obviously, I do agree with sort of with Ukraine joining NATO. I do agree with what we saw as well over the weekend with the G7 committing to more closer security pacts with Ukraine as well. I think that was a good step forward. And then, of course, you have Ben Wallace's comments, which I said we would get into, but well, we've sort of overshot. So this is what he has said about supplying arms. So this is what he had to say. So he said in an interview, I think it was with Sky, he said, there is a slight word of caution here, which is that whether we like it or not, people want to see gratitude. Mr. Wallace said in a briefing to journalists on the sidelines of the two-day NATO summit in Lithuania, the capital of Vilnius. My counsel to the Ukrainians is sometimes you're persuading countries to give up their own stocks of weapons. And yes, the war is a noble war. And yes, we want to see as you doing a war for not just for yourselves but for freedoms. So sometimes you've got to persuade lawmakers on the Hill in America. You've got to persuade the doubting politicians in other countries that you know that it's worth it and worthwhile, that they're getting something for it. And whether you like it or not, that is just the reality of it. So obviously, this is sort of in response to what we've seen a lot of American politicians grumbling about the fact of spending this money on Ukraine. But as I've said before, this is, for their defense. And I think so long as that maintains it for Ukraine's defense, then absolutely we should continue supplying weapons to them. In fact, Zelensky himself said, "Yeah, of course we're grateful for this. Why wouldn't we be grateful for this?" So again, a bit of a diplomatic incident. I think this could also maybe have further repercussions. I haven't seen any Americans politicians who are the big grumblers. Not surprisingly, it's the MAGA people who are like, "Oh yes, Donald Trump could come in and end this war within hours." I very much doubt it, but it tends to be those MAGA politicians on the Hill that he's mainly sort of referring to. Some of course, Republicans saying, "Why are we spending all this money on Ukraine?" But of course, like I say, it is for the reason. It is for, of course, to defend not only just the freedom of the sort of the Ukrainian people for their own sovereignty's sake, but of course, we've got to think about sort of NATO as well. What if Putin had decided to go after a NATO country? Would the alliance hold? Would it activate? We don't know in that potential scenario. Of course, that's one of the things that Putin and his main objective of this war was to weaken NATO and to stop the expansion of NATO as well. But meanwhile, we've had Finland and Switzerland join NATO. So if anything, NATO has only gotten stronger and reaffirmed the ties of having a strong NATO, and in many ways almost reaffirmed as the reason why we have NATO in the first place. So it was an interesting summit, and ultimately, I do think this does bode well for eventually, in certainly the next decade, because that's potentially when it's going to happen for Ukraine to join NATO. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to click on the like and share button on your way out, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.